Classified France 44 is a turn-based tactics games released this March by Absolutely Games. I know I like to say the developer's name as if everyone watching will go, yes, Absolutely Games, terrific company. But here, we're talking about the group that's made their first game. What attracted my attention to Classified is the promise of an improved formula for the XCOM brand of turn-based strategies. I'm always excited to see ways to improve Jake Solomon's excellent design, so playing this was inevitable. The setting is the entirely fictional World War II, which is presented as being inspired by historical events. Like, did these guys open a history book? Jeez. You are given command of a special force tasked with aiding the French resistance and sabotaging the German operations in occupied France. The end goal of your work is to make things easier for the Allied troops on D-Day. Pah, who do they think they're fooling? Amphibious invasion of the French coast? These guys are truly running out of ideas. Who the fuck's gonna believe this horseshit? What's next? They're gonna tell us France is actually a real country with people who actually speak like this?
No, I love cinema, especially westerns. They're a vehicle for radical politics.
Give me a break. But you know what's not shitty and made up? My videos and my Patreon, the place where you can support this channel. I also have a Twitter account where I post stuff that's only sometimes channel updates, if you can believe that. With that out of the way, let's get into it, shall we? So I mentioned something about a change of formula, didn't I? Well, it has plenty of them, that's for sure, but what I like most about it is that you can still see the XCOM skeleton holding it together. That's neat, I have more to talk about then. But I'm not the kind of person who reads pre-release articles and dev blogs and keeps trailers on repeat whenever I'm anticipating a new release, so it should be no surprise to anyone that besides some general things, I have no idea what awaits when trying something new. And naturally, in some cases, it takes some time until I can grasp it and eventually enjoy what it does. Classified France 44 needed 1 minute and 45 seconds from the moment I pressed the start campaign button to achieve that. Just look, it's action points, you beauty, I never thought I'd see you again in my life. Jake Solomon didn't take you away from me, thank Lord. I don't care, you can accuse me of having low standards, this game is already great. I'm well aware of Firaxis XCOM, and as I said in my Jagged Alliance 2 review, I'm very grateful for its role in bringing turn-based tactics game from the grave. However, the unfortunate consequence of its success is that everyone who made one afterwards copied its two-action turn system. It's as if nobody dared to imagine a world where numbers can be used to organize a turn without being a scary prospect. Classified doesn't just grab the bull by its horns, it goes straight into a wrestling match with it. That's because it avoided the trap of swinging into the territory of over-enthusiastic passion for trains, which we otherwise know as realism. Nothing wrong with it, of course, but the only way to get it right is to essentially use wargaming rule sets, and they're not exactly what you'd call a seamless and smooth experience. I praised Jagged Alliance 2's complexity, but I'd be lying if I said it's easy to grab. Specifically, each soldier in Classified has 12 action points to spend by default. Movement costs 1 per tile, and so does interacting with world objects such as doors, switches, medkits, and other stuff to mention a few. Shooting and using abilities vary in cost, and it's pretty apparent that this has been done deliberately to balance each character class. Come on, you can't expect me to believe that a shotgun takes only 1 action point to fire, while an M1 takes a whole 6. It should be noted that stuff like firing a gun or throwing a grenade ends your turn, so you don't get the total flexibility of old school AP systems, but it does provide ample opportunity for strategic decision making. There are plenty of abilities you can use before deciding to take a shot at a German soldier after all. Most importantly, it does that while being simplistic enough to be easy to grab. It makes the preparation of a turn more straightforward affair, since you don't waste time with mental calculations accounting for God knows how many arcane mechanics. The combat itself brings its own share of exciting innovations. Each weapon has a spray area on the path between the shooter and its target. It acts similar to the ballistic system in the likes of Jagged Alliance 2 had, but in a more controlled and contained manner. In other words, you have to put extra considerations on who you're shooting at because you risk hitting teammates, barrels or vehicles. Okay, the last two aren't usually a concern, but there was one occasion where I had to recover some documents from inside the car and blowing it up meant that the files went away in flames, so there is at least an opportunity to care about these things. But on the upside, it also means you can hit 2 or more enemies simultaneously with a single spray. Nothing more satisfying than springing an ambush and mowing down helpless German soldiers before they have time to react. Another reason why these spray areas are essential is the morale system. In Jagged Alliance 2 or in XCOM, whether or not a character loses morale is down to a roll of the dice and some math on the side. You roll snake eyes and your guys start running away, cowering or shooting like maniacs. In Classified, this system has been made entirely transparent because you can always see a character's morale right underneath his health bar. Every shot taken at an enemy inflicts a certain amount of damage to the morale system, regardless of whether they're hit or not. The amount of damage is influenced by specific skills, but most importantly is determined by the weapon's stats. Why is that all important? Because by the time the morale drops by half, a unit is considered suppressed, giving them a sizable penalty to their accuracy and halving their action points at their disposal. Once the morale drops all the way down, a unit is considered broken and loses the entirety of its following turn, making it a sitting duck. A remarkable consequence of this system is that it encourages you to fire at enemies regardless of whether you can hit them or not. Your shotgunner doesn't have a great angle to an enemy? Not a problem, you can still break their morale and pin them down. Of course, it doesn't mean that shooting every single turn is always the best option, but it offers a more strategic choice. Do you move that unit on a new position? Do you try to pin down a particular enemy to better protect one of your flanks? There are numerous situations in which I had to carefully weigh what I did next. The morale system is a net benefit for this. Lastly, the Overwatch system can let you choose the unit you want to shoot instead of the first one that crosses your path. Predictably, I'm a big fan of more options and this isn't an exception. While being stronger, this doesn't drag the game into an Overwatch campfest, mainly due to how missions and levels are designed. I'll go into further details a bit later regarding the missions, but the levels are big enough to not have small choke points that are guaranteed meat grinders. Thus, overwatching is a conscious decision when you want to protect a particular flank that you're worried might be exposed. Since all rules regarding morale apply to Overwatch shots as well, you can use this action not to guarantee a kill necessarily, but to make it as difficult as possible for an opponent to take a shot against your men. There is one aspect I'm ambivalent about, which is the ability to see the tiles overwatched by opponents. Naturally, it would have been incredibly frustrating to have no idea if your men would get shot while moving around, but having these displayed like this makes it very easy to avoid them. It contributes to my argument that the game is too easy at times. Another thought to take a mental note about. Gotta get you hooked to watching the rest of the video somehow. What? You thought that because I went into detail about the action points I finished being floored by the stuff this game brings? Bah, silly you. It just so happens that moving the cursor on the battlefield gives you yet another little gem. You guessed it, all enemy soldiers you can see from a particular spot are highlighted. Oh, XCOM did it already? In that case, I also mentioned the fantastic feature of displaying the aim percentages you'd get if you fired from the tile you currently hold your cursor on. This game's perfect! Just pretend that you don't notice that there's no UI hint to show you the blast tile where you can still take a shot when choosing to move a character. Okay, it's not a perfect game, I have to concede that, particularly in the UI and control department, where it juggles great core concepts with unpolished execution of some basic stuff. This usually isn't an issue, but it does matter when you want to avoid areas of detection during stealth segments, since the default pathfinding is pretty weird about avoiding it. Another aspect that dampens said stealth missions is the inability to switch units after issuing an order. Pretty damn annoying when you're forced to watch your guys slowly crouch walk across levels when in the likes of XCOM you could give orders to all guys in a matter of seconds while the others were still moving. Stranger still when you always have the option to increase the speed of enemy turn animations while you're forced to watch your guys at normal pace. To save the worst for last, I must mention the annoyance of using single left click to conform an order. Once you select a unit, a single click sends it on its own way. No second clicks are needed to confirm. This combined with a series of weird bugs that sometimes interpret a single mouse click as multiple. Since for some reason there are no hotkeys to select each individual unit from your roster, you either have to press tab to cycle through each one of them until you find the guy you want, or you have to select him with your mouse. The latter choice resulted in plenty of soldiers suddenly taking off and wasting their turns because of this issue. The missions you tackle throughout the campaign revolve around three main types: assault, stealth, and ambush. The primary way they differ from one another is the duration of the stealth segment. In assault missions, your men have been engaged in combat since turn 1, so naturally they're the most combat heavy of the bunch. In stealth missions, your men start hidden away from enemies and can remain hidden indefinitely unless you're spotted by an opponent. Finally, ambush missions are something in between. Your men are also hidden initially, but stealthily killing enemies fills up a so-called ambush counter. Once the counter is full, an ambush is triggered, giving your men an entire full turn to wreak havoc on the surprised German troops. Not only are they out of cover, but your troops get sizable bonuses for accuracy, health and morale damage. Because you know precisely when you trigger this ambush, you can get your guys in the best positions possible before it's showtime. This is another potent tool in your repertoire, making the entire feature quite distinct from XCOM 2's. But, and there's a big one here, the stealth itself is, at most, a passable experience. Sure, it has nice quality of life stuff, such as an icon indicating where an enemy will go in the next turn, or noise overlays for all the stuff that can create it. Unfortunately, these two things also make the entire thing straightforward with less challenge than expected. Very rarely you have to use the ability to throw a rock to force an enemy to face a different direction, so most of the time you're just stabbing enemies and slowly moving your troops across the levels. Remember when a couple of minutes ago I complained that you can't give out any orders while your units are still moving? Thank God, I thought nobody was listening anymore. So, while ambush missions have their own spice, the exclusively stealth missions that can be completed without triggering any alarm tend to be boring. It's always cool to methodically pick off all patrols that get in your way, but they're big time sinks with little to show for. Besides these three prominent mission archetypes, the missions themselves are pretty varied. Each one you play is handmade and there's no procedurally generated level like in XCOM 2, and no map is reused like in the first XCOM. The work of Absolutely Games is commendable since we're talking about roughly 30 unique missions, each with their own locations, objectives and overall style. Among the stuff you have to do, you have going to an airfield to sabotage a fancy new bomber, assassinating SS officers, stealing engineering plans of new tanks, sabotaging a vital bridge, and the list can go on in terms of variety. I never felt the missions were repetitive since each had a general theme and gameplay quirks. Also, their level design is well made in that it does a great job complementing the gameplay. As I mentioned when I discussed the power of Overwatch ability, most levels only offer you a few opportunities to lock down the movement of an entire opposition, since the layout provides plenty of options for moving around. Said layout also works in your favor, of course, and it's clear the design intent was not only to prevent but also discourage Overwatch camping. Even if you like to play on the defensive, the crazy moves you can pull once you get in the mindset of throwing caution to the wind represent a prospect that is too enticing to ignore at times. There's one exception though, and that's the reinforcement system. Most levels will bring in more enemy patrols, either at fixed number of turns or depending on the number of enemies you killed and objectives completed. It's an excellent system because of the added pressure, even if it doesn't reinvent the concept in any significant way. But the problem is that the marker designates their point and turn of entry on the map before their arrival. This means that it's a great idea to just overwatch these locations because you're guaranteed to do a lot of damage to the health and morale of helpless troops. That's not to mention that once they pop in, they only get half a turn, which they are unable to attack. I really don't understand the justification for making reinforcements so helpless. Granted, there are missions when the added pressure they bring does make things pretty challenging and sometimes forcing you to extract as soon as possible, but most of the time their arrival just adds more corpses to the pile without bringing in any contribution against your own troops. The campaign map component is pretty damn interesting. On the one hand, the counter to D-Day really gives the same vibes as the Avatar Project counter in XCOM 2, only that in this case the deadline is mainly fixed and there's very little you can do to adjust it, which, you know, it makes sense. Every mission you partake in puts you 2 days closer to the Allied assault of occupied France, and sometimes you get special events which can ask you to spend days for some rewards, but that's about it. Your mission is to get the resistance as strong as possible in preparation for D-Day and help out the 3 factions as much as you can. Getting more support from one faction over others makes no difference in itself, but what you care about are the territories in which they have control. That's because every time you successfully complete a mission for one of the factions, you get the opportunity to solidify a slice of a French province, and once you complete all 3 segments of a province, you get a region-specific bonus. Some are more important than others, such as reducing the time needed to cure a soldier or receiving more rewards at the end of a mission, but you need as many as possible to reach your campaign's goals and solidifying the resistance strength. Another benefit is better access to their weapon and equipment stores. It's not a vast selection, but some of the stuff you can find there, especially at higher levels of support, is pretty damn good. I only went into a bit of detail regarding the weapons when discussing gameplay because there's not that much variety to them besides the core mechanics of it all. Some of them have special modifications that give specific benefits to the user, but besides some really powerful synergies, they don't change the fundamental way of using them. All sniper rifles fill in the same role as do all rifles, shotguns or submachine guns. Your choices will mostly be about which one has better stats, which is fine for a system that didn't seem intended to be deep to begin with. Granted, the announced DLCs promise to increase the weapon pool, so take what I've said about them with a pinch of salt. Besides going on missions, you also have additional tasks you can send your men to perform. Besides curing injuries, you can send men to aid a faction and increase their support of you, train someone, recruit special French resistance agents, or recover lost portions of territory. The last 2 things are directly tied to the Germans' ability to send military police and Gestapo officers to regions with solid resistance control in their attempts to decrease their strength. The special French resistance tokens can block their activities and buy you some time. It seems cool at first glance, but unfortunately, by the end of the game, you end up with so many of these agents that you can permanently block any German attempt to disrupt your control of the strategic map. Another factor that makes the strategic map unchallenging is the supplies you have at your disposal. All the activities I mentioned and the equipment you can buy from the resistance stores are paid using this currency. Despite playing on the hardest difficulty, I never ended up in a situation where I couldn't afford to send a soldier to a task. That's because by the mid-game onwards, I could complete all main and side objectives of every mission I took, bringing in the maximum amount of supplies I could get. In many cases, it wasn't even a contest because of how powerful my soldiers became as they leveled up. This doesn't mean no levels were challenging anymore, of course, but we're talking about at most 2-3 missions that were very hard to get through. Before explaining how much the power spike breaks the missions, I'd rather discuss the good parts of the progression system. Each soldier has a progression tree consisting of 4 main branches. These branches contain a mix of passive and active abilities, with some offering only marginal percentage-based benefits and others significantly changing the way you can play the game. Some unlocks increase the damage you make with certain weapons, others give you better accuracy, more armor, health and action points, but others are much more powerful and impressive. I am talking specifically about the slew of abilities that manipulate or outright flip the whole action point turn system upside down. You have abilities that prevent ending your turn if you kill an enemy with one shot, and others give action points whenever you do a melee kill. Yes, you read that right, you can have turns where a single guy can kill multiple enemies because they can keep chaining attacks. Then you have things like medical abilities which can give you even more action points. In other words, with enough well leveled up soldiers and good knowledge of your own, you can end up chaining some ridiculously powerful turns. XCOM 2 had many of these of course, but exploiting these combos in some stages was more necessary due to how ruthless that game can be. Classified doesn't share the same ruthlessness unfortunately. For starters, none of your soldiers can die. When their health points drop to 0, they get downed and can be revived to continue the fight. Or you don't and they get up on their own after 3 turns. They get their health points down to 0 again and they just leave the mission, which admittedly puts you in a rough spot since having just 3 soldiers makes missions a lot more complicated. The post-match consequences of having wounded soldiers consists of -1 health or morale point for every increment of their respective injuries. The fatigue caused by using the same soldiers multiple missions in a row is much more punishing since each point decreases the number of action points at their disposal. So, as you can see, there's little punishment dealt if you don't play your hand perfectly on each mission. By the time you reach late game, you can mow through many German soldiers, including breaking the morale of multiple at a time and make them utterly non-threatening for their following turn. The only exception to this is the SS soldiers and officers who come with lots of health, a ridiculous amount of armor and some powerful abilities. Besting them is still doable, but you can get the idea. Of course, there is also the matter of the AI, which sometimes takes some really questionable choices, such as overwatching a wall multiple turns in a row for some reason. Yeah, I think this needs to be patched. I know I joked about Baguette Land not being a real country, but on a serious note, I have to say that the setting is pretty damn great. This could have easily been your run-of-the-mill merryman doing a little trolling and having a good time kind of story, but it isn't. It's lighthearted, true, but it takes advantage of the French setting in a way I honestly wasn't expecting. 2 of the factions you help are the Gaullists and the Radicals, and they provide plenty of opportunity for flavorful world building. The Gaullists are supporters of Charles de Gaulle. Aren't you glad you're tuning in for these riveting and insightful analysis pieces? Anyhow, There are also big supporters of the American and British helping the war effort against Germany. Despite working together against German occupiers, they feel suspicious towards the radicals, which they view as communist and Soviet sympathizers. The radicals, on the other hand, deeply mistrust the former because they perceive de Gaulle as just as a vehicle of Anglo-American interests and nothing more, and not the person who will bring the socialist France they desire. All these things are shown and built upon in many character interactions you witness after each mission, either in cinematics or dialogue segments in your base camp. I have to make a small parenthesis here and say that Classified isn't an overly replayable title regarding gameplay, but because each character has his own vision over this dispute, it's worth it to replay the campaign and choose different character combinations to recruit along the way so you can get unique interactions. It's only a shame that these interactions can only occur between soldiers you deployed during missions, so those outside of your A team will sadly be left out. I won't pretend I'm in any way a profound connoisseur of interwar French politics because, on the one hand, I'm not a masochist, and on the other, what I'm about to say is more surface level. What I find very interesting about the Gaullist radical rivalry is that they reflect a simple reality that just because a massive war was started and France got catastrophically defeated, it didn't mean that the French simply forgot about the world they lived in the decade prior to this. Plenty of time is dedicated to topics such as whether or not the socialists are also Soviet sympathizers, or how much protection of individual liberties really was offered by the other camps of French politics before the occupation. The segment where the French socialist student breaks to the skeptical French Canadian hunter the news that the German camps weren't actually work camps is pretty chilling on its own, especially when you consider that in 1944 it wasn't well known what was going on there. At the same time, the perception of de Legolas, a puppet controlled by the Americans and British, is pretty damn ironic considering the positions he took after the war. All in all, Classified France 44 is an excellent addition to the turn-based tactics genre, considering that this was created by a small team on what's likely not to have been a very impressive budget. It manages to hold up very well in a genre with long and robust legacy. My complaint about the low difficulty comes from someone who spent perhaps thousands of hours in the likes of Jagged Alliance and XCOM among many others. Those less familiar with these kind of games might find it a good balance from their own perspective. But even ignoring that, I can't fail to see that there was a lot of passion put into this and a lot of good design as well. You can only provide a streamlined but complex enough of an experience that provides both satisfaction and strategic depth if you know what you're doing. Absolutely nailed it. Oh god, just put me out of my misery. Thanks to everyone for watching. Smash the subscribe button, look at the shiny effect implemented by YouTube, and share this video with your like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!